Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be working on this slideshow, which will have accompanying notes. These notes are going to be in your Google Classroom. I'll post them there, and they should be there right now when you're seeing this video, but they'll look like this. It's very similar to other notes we've taken with a chart, where you have definition examples and discussion questions in the columns, and in the rows you have the three different source types or information source types that we will be covering today. So just listen along to the slideshow and take notes within your chart so I know you're following along. There, first off, are three source types. A lot of you guys actually got this correctly in our source or information source pretest. So I want to say good job to everyone who got this right. But if you didn't, it's okay. You guys are going to be learning this type of stuff throughout this unit. So there are three source types: primary, secondary, and tertiary. You can of course pause the recording right now to copy down the definitions, but I will go into depth quite a bit for each of these source types as I continue with this slideshow presentation. The first type of source is a primary source. The definition for a primary source is an immediate, first-hand account of a topic from people who had direct connections with it. So primary sources are pretty unique in this sense, as only certain types of people can generate this type of source. For example, a person who actually lived through the event. Therefore, I can never be, no matter how hard I try, a primary source on the civil rights era of the 1960s, because I was not alive in the 1960s. Some examples of primary sources are like texts of laws, newspaper reports, speeches, diaries. They can be various things. And a question I'm going to pose to you guys is, in 100 years, what kind of primary sources might the historians of the future utilize? Pause the video and then answer that question, and then unpause the video and I'll kind of give my own thoughts on it. Okay, I'm assuming you've unpaused now. So yeah, what I kind of think, I feel like they're going to be using a lot of like our phones maybe, social media, other things that we record information about ourselves. Because all these sources, texts of laws, newspaper reports, speeches, diaries, that's all historians attempting to understand how the people of the past thought. So I feel like one of the more useful primary sources are going to be, for the future, like in 100 years, are going to be like social media. I feel like a lot of us record how our lives are on social media. So I think that's going to be a useful example of a primary source for historians if they're, say, for example, studying the time period of the 2020s. I feel like social media will be a big tool. Next up, secondary sources. I'll just read off the definition real quick. These sources are one step removed from primary sources. However, they do often quote or otherwise use primary sources inside of them. They do cover the same topic, but they add a layer of interpretation and analysis. This is the big thing you want to remember. Secondary sources have interpretation and analysis, as opposed to primary sources, which just kind of tell you how people were thinking at that time and usually lay out kind of perspectives from that time period. It's going to be interpretation and analysis for secondary sources. So for example, if we're looking at like a book about World War II versus like a primary source from World War II. Primary source from World War II could be like an account of a battle from a soldier, from like an American soldier. But a book or a secondary source on the topic of World War II will compile hundreds of different interviews of soldiers from World War II from both sides, the Nazis, Nazi Germans, the Japanese, the Americans, the Soviets, the British. Will compile it all into a book and tell one coherent story based off of that knowledge that they gained from those primary sources, those interviews with those soldiers. Some examples of secondary sources are most books, data interpretation, so a lot of graphics are a secondary source. Scholarly articles, probably my favorite secondary source. I really like reading scholarly articles. And many documentaries can be considered secondary sources as well. You can also tell me in your work, what's your favorite documentary, your favorite historical documentary. You can even say, to a certain extent, some documentaries like docudramas, when utilized or when they try to use a lot of historical like work to make the docudrama pretty effective, you could even say that's a secondary source. Of course, one thing I'm going to bring up is all sources have their limitations, which is something you're going to talk about, and I'll bring that up at the end of the video. Um, so, like for example, my favorite docudrama is one called Our Mothers and Our Fathers, and it tells the story of World War II from the side of the Germans, specifically young Germans, Germans who weren't really responsible for like a lot of the bad stuff that happened. It's pretty interesting, pretty provocative, pretty controversial. I'm not recommending it though because you guys, it's like an R-rated movie or it's an R-rated docudrama, so you didn't hear that from me. I'm not recommending it. I'm just giving that as an example of my favorite documentary. But the real question I want you to put in your notes, and please do this, is in 100 years, what kind of primary sources might the historians, or my bad, in 100 years, what kind of secondary sources might the historians of the future utilize? I'll give you guys a second to kind of answer that question. So pause the video and then unpause so I can give you my take. Okay, hi everyone. Anyways, I think the secondary sources are probably going to remain similar. I think books are going to still be used, but I think that the internet is going to be a huge secondary source, or specific portions of the internet going to be a huge secondary source that future historians in like the year 2120 will rely upon to understand today. It's just easier to archive. It's easier to collaborate online. So maybe scholarly institutions where people share papers online. I think online journal articles, online scholarly articles will be huge secondary sources in the future that historians will utilize to tell the story of the 2020s. If like historians in 2120 will use to explain kind of what's happening in 2020. I think that's going to be a source they rely upon. Tertiary sources. This is the final source type. So I'll just read the definition again real fast. These are sources that index, abstract, organize, compile, or digest other sources that are usually not credited to a particular author. That's the main thing. These sources tend to be the works of many authors put together. So examples of the source type are like dictionaries. One single person doesn't write the dictionary. Encyclopedias, that's a bunch of authors putting in their input into different encyclopedia articles. Guidebooks, again, more authors. And textbooks, that's usually a group of professionals working together to compile a source to explain something to people. It's an information source. Wikipedia, here's another example, is a tertiary source. And this is what I want to bring up real quick. Let me just check this is the last slide. So this is one more thing I want to bring up. Sources, just because it's called primary, doesn't inherently make it better than a secondary and tertiary source. Just because a source is considered a tertiary source, like a Wikipedia, does not make it inherently worse than a primary source or a secondary source. Every source type, primary, secondary, and tertiary, have their strengths and weaknesses, which we'll get into in a little discussion after this. So first, the question that I want you to write in your notes is, which source type have you used the most when learning about your history so far in your academic careers? Pause the video, answer the question, and then I'll give you like my little answer. Okay, I'm back, everyone. The source type when I was a freshman that I used the most up to that point was tertiary sources. I used mostly textbooks in like middle school and kind of like encyclopedia entries in middle school. I didn't really get on to using primary sources quite yet, which you're going to be doing this unit. And I also didn't really get into secondary sources either. I honestly think secondary sources are one of the hardest sources to crack, but I think they're one of the most valuable. But again, all sources have their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, since you've seen that slideshow presentation, you should have a good grasp, or you should have an answer to everything in these boxes. The definition, the little examples I gave, and then the discussion question. The discussion question is the little question at the bottom of each slide. Next up, we have the source viewing questions. I'm just going to ask you guys this question, write down your little prediction. It's not really a prediction because these are a bit opinion-based, and then I'll give you guys my input as well. So first question, of the three sources, oh, my bad. You can't do this yet. We'll do this tomorrow, actually. Today, all you need to do is fill in this chart and then also brainstorm what are the strengths and weaknesses of the sources that we have at our disposal. Primary, secondary, and tertiary. You don't have to write anything down for that. You just have to brainstorm. And then tomorrow, we'll get into the second half of this activity. Thanks for your time. Let me know if you have any questions and email me if you have any questions. Have a good day. Bye.